Good afternoon, everyone. This is Knut Rostad with the Institute for the Fiduciary Standard. And today is September 24th, the 24th day of Fiduciary September. I hope you all are enjoying your Fiduciary September and celebrating it appropriately every day, all day long. Today we have the fifth of 7 panels that the Institute is putting on this month. Our final 2 panels are tomorrow and on Thursday. Today we are focused on the state of fiduciary at the Securities and Exchange Commission, the main quote-unquote regulator of investment advisors. I always try to also say that they are not the only regulator of investment advisors, and the states play a pivotal role, thank goodness, as does the Department of Labor. On the state level, well, I should say, we have two speakers here today. Alan Moore, CEO of XY Planning, and with most of his members, I believe, focused or regulated by the state. So that is a good perspective to include. And then the one and the only Bob Veras, who is now waving to everyone. Bob has been observing and explaining and trying to get a picture of the future of the world of financial planning for just about 42 years. That takes us back to 1982, when we were in a different world, but Bob is keeping us on track with the world that we have today. I also am pleased to say that in addition to all his attributes and accomplishments, Bob is the honoree of this year's Frankel Fiduciary Prize Award, and where I had the privilege of presenting it to him at his conference last week in Denver. So in a moment, I will hand the microphone off to Bob, and he will start the discussion with some prepared remarks. He asked that everybody who's going to pose a question, keep it simple and straightforward, so it's not too difficult for us to handle in this point. But before we get going, I wanted to just mention a interesting update from the Securities and Exchange Commission last week. On Thursday, the chairman of the SEC gave a short statement before the Investment Advisory Committee that was meeting. And in that statement, he defined fiduciary in the way that it was defined up until about 5 years ago, where the key point was putting the interests of the investor client first. And the reason why that's noteworthy is because beginning 5 years ago, the SEC has taken a different position on what what fiduciary means, and it basically demoted fiduciary to be at the same level as the broker-dealer Reg BI standard, more or less, wherever that is. Of course, that's not defined. So I just wanted to point that out at the beginning, that there is new news on this front as of last week. It's not clear to me, frankly, what it means, but it is out there, and the chairman is on the record. So with that brief introduction, I will hand the microphone over to Bob Veras. Welcome, Bob.
Well, thank you, Knut, and welcome everybody. You know, as Knut said, I have some history in this profession, and I've been watching the regulatory efforts for 42 years now. And if I were to draw a chart, the chart would be similar to what you see in a bull and a bear market. It would be a very long, gradual bear market until 5 to 7 years ago, at which point it dropped precipitously, which is a nasty bear market. And when I first got into this business in the early 80s, the SEC, generally speaking, followed what I would consider to be the spirit of the 40 Act, which was to prevent touts and tipsters, as the apocrypha around the 40 Act mentioned, to prevent them from taking advantage of consumers. And it all goes back, of course, to the trusts that were so badly managed and were thinly veiled Ponzi schemes back in the 20s and late 20s and early 30s. And then at some point, the brokerage industry came out with its Tully report, I think it was 1989, which basically said that brokers should probably be fiduciary or probably be compensated by fees. I don't think the word fiduciary is mentioned. And at that point, we saw a little bit of a dip in the way the SEC anyway saw the concept of fiduciary, that the idea was that the brokers didn't really need to register with the SEC and therefore didn't need to conform to the fiduciary standard as outlined by the Supreme Court, because they were moving in the right direction, and let's encourage them to move in the right direction, and let's not impose something that they might find inconvenient. And I actually talked to Bob Plays about this. Bob Plays was a senior staffer at the SEC who was instrumental in giving the SEC a pass on having to conform to all this, giving the brokerage industry a pass on having to conform to actual fiduciary standards. And he cheerfully admitted, yeah, we were wrong. We thought that the brokerage industry would follow the advisor model and they would reform themselves. And the Tully Commission told us that, and it turns out they didn't. And then came the scandals about the what do you call them? The people who evaluate stocks and bonds for their customers, and then there were the scandals about the mortgage trusts in the 2008 and 2009, and the SEC never corrected that error. And then at some point there was a complete regulatory capture of the SEC, as I see it. And I've actually written a short story about it, how that happened. But the gist of the story, the plot of the story is that some young SEC attorney, or was hired by the SEC, comes in and he's quite ambitious and he believes that fairness should govern the marketplace. And he brings cases, and the cases are mysteriously settled in ways that favor the brokerage industry. And his higher ups tend to be less supportive of his efforts. And gradually over time, the people in the desks around him are hired away by the brokerage firms for 7-figure salaries, or they join a law firm that works with brokerage firms for similar salaries. And he's told at some point that if you don't play ball, you're not going to get that payoff that everybody else is getting. And meanwhile, at home, he's got to decide, should I work for myself and my family, or should I work for the fairness of the marketplace, which is not actually working at the SEC? And I think what happened is the SEC decided, or the SEC staff decided, that their best interests individually was to play ball with the brokerage firms. And the fiduciary standard was an awkward distinction between brokers and fiduciary advisors, fee-only advisors. So eventually the brokerage industry began to say, why don't you, eliminate? And to me, the early sign that we were going to get a bear market in fiduciary regulation was when I called it the Shapiro Doctrine, when Mary Shapiro said, basically announced that, well, the public thinks that brokers and advisors are pretty much the same thing, and so we're going to regulate them the same way. And that created, I think, the blueprint for how the SEC staff has moved They basically say, hey, everybody has conflicts of interest, and so therefore don't say you have fewer conflicts of interest than them, even though that might be true. To me, the right way to regulate the profession, I'll end with this because I think it's a pretty simple model, is how many of the obvious conflicts of interest have you decided to give up in your activities in the marketplace? If you don't accept commissions, then there's no real danger that you're going to churn your clients' accounts or customers' accounts. There's no real danger that you're going to recommend unsuitable investments. So there are certain, I think the regulatory burden, ideally, number one, should be lighter on the people who've given up conflicts of interest. And there are conflicts of interest built into the model where you're paid by your employer rather than by the customer or the client. The brokerage firms basically employ asset gatherers who are supposedly paid by fees, but in fact, their mission is to gather as many assets as possible for portfolios that the brokerage firms have shelf space arrangements with. They don't call it that, but that's effectively what it is. And so what I would want to happen if I had my wishes, and I don't have my wishes in case anybody's curious about that, but if I had my wishes, advisors who give up certain conflicts of interest, certain major conflicts of interest, would be regulated more lightly, number one, and number two, they would be encouraged to tell the consumer audience about the conflicts that they've given up so that the consuming public would know that there are people with fewer conflicts who perhaps put their interests ahead of others. There are other conflicts, obviously, and there are other issues. I know that family advisors who are not really that grounded in the technical details of their advice, and that's an issue that ought to be addressed. But for the most part, I think the concept of fiduciary is a marketplace argument. We're not going to win over the brokerage firms to be fiduciaries when it's not in their best interest. But I think in the marketplace, we can market the idea that we're more on your side than they are, and we can prove it, and we can be held to that standard. And so what I would like the SEC to do is allow advisors, or even encourage advisors, to talk to clients and the public about what it would be like to give up these conflicts and become more consumer focused and maybe less dangerous or predatory to the marketplace.
Thank you, Bob. Now let's go into Alan. I should have said at the outset, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box, and as soon as Alan is done, and I will we'll get to your questions. Alan.
Hello, everyone. My name is Alan Moore. As said earlier, I'm one of the co-founders and CEO of XY Planning Network, alongside Michael Kitsis, who you may know from the blue shirt. So we are a platform of financial advisors who are focused on serving next-gen clients. So we help advisors start, run, and grow their own independent RIA. All of our advisors are fee-only. All of them sign the fiduciary oath made by the Fiduciary Institute years ago. It is available to consumers. So we're true believers in the model. I grew up in financial planning, got my degrees in financial planning, and I just thought everyone did comprehensive life planning, because I went to University of Georgia, and we had a institute where the financial planners and the marriage and family therapists would work together with clients. So I just thought that's just how the whole industry was, until I got my first internship at Smith Barney, and you can imagine the shock and awe of what the industry is really like. So, at XYPN, we help advisors start their own firm. We have just shy of 2,000 advisors that are affiliated with XYPN, which is about 1,550 firms, many of which, I think about 1,200 of those, we've actually helped register. As said earlier, we are mainly focused on state level advisors. However, we do have a fair number of SEC registered advisors. And so, I'm not the historian of the fiduciary standard and where it goes. I have my qualms with sort of where The SEC has put their focus, as well as where the what I would say where the associations in our space that are sort of on our side of this or should be, where they're putting their resources or not, and that sort of thing. But to Bob's point earlier, I do believe that there is room in the marketplace, and it's perfectly acceptable to have salespeople and to have fiduciary advisors. I'm fine with that. We've never been in the business of how do we eliminate all commissions, which obviously some countries have done successfully. Like, I would love to see that, but like, that's not our mission. That's not what we're trying to do. And when we've written comment letters to the SEC and Department of Labor in the past, we'll use the metaphor of, when I'm going to buy a cut of meat, I know if I'm talking to a butcher or my nutritionist, I know that one of those is trying to sell me a steak and the other one is giving me advice related to what I should be eating and what's best for me. And, that distinction is so clear when you go buy a steak, and yet so unclear when you work with a financial advisor, because the vast majority of consumers believe their advisor is a fiduciary at all times. I believe that most advisors believe they are a fiduciary at all times. I get really blank looks from folks who it may be only registered with a broker dealer, not even associated with an RIA, and they're saying like, well, of course I always do right by my client. I always do what's in their best interest. And I like to remind them that it's only a fiduciary standard if you can be held legally liable for not honoring it. And so, that's kind of come to the shock of like, what do you mean we're not? Like, of course we do what's in their best interest, because that's what Reg BI said. So it is a really interesting landscape, and we can talk more about this in detail. But our focus at XYPN, we do because of, quite frankly, because some of the lack of funding and resources that have been put towards this by the associations. We, even though we're a for-profit company, have hired an advocacy director to be able to focus on some of the things that are pertinent to our members. And our big area of focus is around title reform, because we believe that is the quickest way. It's a really narrow way that we think can actually get instituted that would have cascading effects on the industry. If we could get it to where you can only use the term financial advisor when you are an advice giver, and you cannot use that term if you are not. And so that's sort of our focus from a regulatory standpoint at this stage. And then last thing I'll say is, Bob, your story about that SEC attorney made me chuckle, because I just watched the documentary around, or the mockumentary, I should say. I think it was on Netflix, on Purdue Pharma and the creation of OxyContin. And part of that story is that the FDA doctor who did all the reviews and all the things and ultimately approved their marketing messaging, which was a shock to everyone, ultimately ended up working there. And probably got a seven-figure. Now, of course, no accusations were made, but those are realities that I think many industries face. And it's an unfortunate reality that is a separate conversation.
My goal in this presentation is to make Alan chuckle. So I've achieved my goal.
Okay, Bob, but you can't leave just yet, even though you've achieved your goal. So thank you, Alan. I want to add a couple of comments based on one thing that Bob said, and another point that Alan made. Bob's comment that this issue is a marketplace issue as opposed to a regulatory issue. If you've written about this, Bob, I don't recall sort of how you drilled down on that, but I think he's spot on, because that goes into a couple of comments I will make shortly. And then the other thing I want to mention, Alan, I want you to know how much I appreciate you using that butcher versus nutritionist, because and Bob may know this, because the beginnings of that was like 18 years ago, when Harold Levinsky and I made one of the first sort of rough ads about this, and which was later taken over by some firm in Chicago and made more popular. But I thank you for saying that.
Yeah.
When I speak to Harold again, I'll let him know that his words are still out here in the marketplace. So anyway, what I wanted to add in terms of this conversation and where it goes is, as I shared with Bob and Alan yesterday, is to sort of raise a question. is the status of the fiduciary standard as it is at the SEC, is that something that ordinary advisors and planners should be concerned about? Not from a broad philosophical level, but from a narrower level in terms of the best interest of their own firm. And then, if they should be, what can be done about it? In light of the fact that, as Bob referenced, and everyone knows, this is a David and Goliath battle in Washington. And I would go further. The idea of sort of focusing the argument or the battle in Washington is a new version of playing on someone's home turf, and playing on your adversary's home turf, and to their advantage and to your disadvantage. So what I wanted to sort of move the conversation along is in terms of, what is it that, given the differences in size and numbers, can what I refer to as the 7%, meaning our estimation is of this really 300,000, probably 7% could meet our standard practices. What is it that we can do better to protect and defend what it is that makes a planner, advisor, a professional, and that is fiduciary? Bob, do you want to, before we open it up, do you want to say anything or any further comments on that?
I have many things to say about it, but I'll keep it short. One concern is that we just had Tom Giacchetti speak at our conference a week ago. And his message basically was the SEC is increasingly hostile to fee-only financial planners and independent RIAs in the inspections that they do in the office. And they're now, it used to be you couldn't get out without being written up about something, but now they're looking for ways to little foot faults where they want you to write big checks to your clients because there's a small this or a tiny that that they believe is actionable, if you will. I think what we're dealing with, though, is I don't think there's any way to win this battle in the SEC anymore. I think we have to kind of give up on that because I think the SEC has now been captured. All we can do is embarrass them. My story would embarrass them. Periodically, I'll say that the brokerage firms forbid the SEC from doing this or that. So the battle is going to have to be won in the marketplace. And the interesting thing is it is being won. The independent RIA community is gradually, incrementally, not nearly as fast as I wanted to, taking market share away from the big firms. And increasingly, consumers are realizing that there's a predatory agenda at the brokerage firms that doesn't exist in the RIA community. We may very well get another ugly, horrible scandal. I've actually predicted that it's going to happen shortly because I don't know what it will be, but I know that the incentives in the wirehouse world encourage these kinds of excesses and predatory behavior. So, another bunch of headlines and a lot of, fomentation in Congress, and then the SEC scrambling to cover itself because it missed whatever was going on. And that may, make the consumers slightly more aware of these things. And then, incrementally, these things have a way of getting through the veneer of publicity to the public. But generally speaking, I think the damage is being done in the regulatory documentation and the inspections, but the marketplace is a free-for-all. You are not allowed to say, based on your disclosures under Reg BI, that you're a fiduciary. They discourage you from doing that. There's nothing to discourage you from saying that in your advertising and your marketing. And incidentally, the compliance departments of the brokerage firms don't let the brokers talk to the press. They don't let them create their own videos. They don't allow the marketing that the RIA community could do. So my recommendation would be for the RIA community to step up your marketing efforts, because that's where you have a bit of an advantage.
Thank you. Alan, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we could talk about just all the different ways you could go about it. Like, and I agree with Bob that at the furthest reach is going to be an act of Congress. So that's going to be the least likely, if you will. Then you've
Let's
got
hold
sort
our
of
breath.
acts of the right. And maybe another financial crisis or something does sort of push us that direction. I do have concerns with the recent Supreme Court ruling on the Chevron ruling on just how far some of the agencies are going to be able to go before they start getting sued into peeling back to what the laws say, which is obviously very, very narrow. And don't say a whole lot. So I think that's an interesting piece, but I don't think we can count on that, nor do I really want to see a crisis be the reason we finally make this move. Then it kind of peels back that maybe a little more likely would be a change at the SEC, which ultimately the tides of political favor do come in and out and go from left to right and back again. So you may see a change there where the SEC is more willing to take a hard line. Even more willing, I think, is the Department of Labor. They've already proven that they're willing to go out on a limb and put themselves in a position where they know they're going to get sued into oblivion by very well-funded lobbyists to try to enact consumer protections. And we will continue to see what happens there. And then I would say, maybe somewhere in between those two would be the state regulators. The beauty of the state regulators is they truly do not adhere to pretty much any oversight from the SEC or and it appears very limited interaction. And while it does create a fragmented regulatory marketplace, which can be challenging, which, it makes me chuckle that like the SEC to us is the simple one because they only have one set of rules that apply to all advisors, whereas the states, we've got 50 different sets of rules that are largely unwritten, and different regulators in the same state have different interpretations. And so we constantly run into issues where the folks who are registering advisors or approving registrations are not in alignment with the people who are doing the audits, and that can create conflicts because like, well, they told me I could do that, and like, well, that's not their job. That's my job now. I'm your auditor. It can create challenges. And then, to Bob's point, I think the most likely opportunity that we have is around the marketplace and seeing the invisible hand of the market continue to move us in this direction. I mean, you see the growth of and the impact that NAPFA had over the years. I really wish I could go back in time when NAPFA was founded to say, don't say fee only, say fiduciary only. Like own the fiduciary mantle, the fiduciary only mantle. And I think that would continue to persist today. But I do think even the rise of XYPN and the fact that we've been able to grow to over almost 2,000 advisors is proof that you can absolutely build a very successful firm working as a fiduciary 100% of the time. We do not allow any of our advisors to be affiliated with broker-dealers, insurance agencies, anything like that. But we are seeing sort of the proportion of advisory firms that are getting started that are fee only increasing, and a lot of that is just due to the growth of XYPN's membership. So I wish there was an easy answer on this, but I do think it's going to take, there is a market component. I do struggle with it sometimes just because the data says that negative advertising just hurts everyone. It doesn't actually change public perception, but clearly something is working because consumers are aware. They are getting the understanding of what it means to be a fiduciary, and they're looking for that advice.
Thank you.
And
Thank you,
I'm
Alan.
just add here that my sense is that the associations and the CFP board they've almost given up. They realize they're not going to get any traction with the SEC, and Congress has no interest in this issue, and so you don't see a lot of activity on their part. The FPA wanted to create title protection, but I haven't seen much action on that score lately, and I'm wondering how committed they are to it now. So what's happening is there's not really much effort, and maybe that's appropriate because there's not really much opportunity for something to happen at the Congress level and at the SEC level. I think there is an opportunity at the state level, but everybody says, oh, we don't want 50 different fiduciary standards and we don't want this and that, but I think maybe we do. Maybe the states are where we should be focusing our efforts. They're a lot more amenable, I think, to actual consumer protection than the federal agencies.
And I would go the next step, or another step, Bob, and say about the states that my sense is that they actually understand what it is that makes fiduciary so important. And when I look at what has been produced by the SEC, it's not clear to me that they understand. And I think the best, a very good example of that, and you alluded to, I think, in your opening remarks, is over the last, and I think of the last 15 years, because it was when Chairman Shapiro ran up to New York to give her statement about how wonderful fiduciary is when the white paper came out of the Obama administration. And then down and further in her speech, she said, oh, by the way, and this is what you go, there's not that much a difference between BDs and IAs, because, and she used words to say, because that's what the public sees or believes. And this was a very radical thought, a very radical notion, but that to me was the starting point, the march towards 2019. And in that process, to get around, the SEC has orchestrated the basic idea that conflicts of interest don't matter so much anymore. And they've done that by, as you said, saying that we all have conflicts of interest. And so what, it's almost like, what difference does it make if everyone has them? And without
We're all
even
guilty of original sin, right? So
well,
there's no
there you
difference
go.
between the
So
mass murderer and a child molester and the law-abiding citizen, right? I agree.
Yeah. So anyway, I wanted to add that point in terms of the states and the SEC. We've got one question so far. Where did it go?
Now remember, these are only easy to answer questions. Okay.
These are easy to answer. Hey, Sam, if you want to, well, since we're a relatively small number, do you want to ask your question directly to Bob and Alan, as long as it's an easy question?
Easy question, yeah. So a few months ago, we had a decision at the state level in Massachusetts that basically said that Robinhood had to be held to a fiduciary standard in that state. Could you guys weigh in on that and what it might mean for the future of the fiduciary standard at the state level nationally?
Well, I think I'll jump in. I think Massachusetts is light years ahead of everybody else, and relatively liberal state, relatively active state regulator, and I'm not sure many states are going to follow Massachusetts, but I think ultimately they could provide a model that others could follow when we start to get more. The next scandal maybe will cause states to look at that model.
Alan, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, I was excited when I saw that, not because I disliked Robinhood, but just because I think, what was it, 2020 that Massachusetts actually issued their fiduciary rule that sort of brought everyone in operating in Massachusetts under their uniform standard of care and made everyone a fiduciary. And this was a great case to be able to test it and see, did the Massachusetts Supreme Court believe that the Massachusetts regulators had the right to the right to enact it? So when we talk to regulators, because we have advisors, we have firms in all 50 states and are very active with the regulators in conversations, we do hear that they are talking to each other. And so it may feel like the individual regulators are very separated. But the regulators, so, we're based here in Montana, and we were on the phone with our Montana regulator chatting about a firm that was getting registered. And she referenced that she was in a study group with regulators from Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Colorado. And so they have their own study group where they're meeting and they're chatting about, what are you seeing? What are you doing? What are you hearing? And so they are talking amongst each other. And so I even see this with like the SEC's testimonial rule. When they rolled that out, most of the state regulators were like, we're going to see what happens with this. Like, we're not going to copy the rule and roll it out. Let's just sort of wait and see, which admittedly does put state registered advisors at a comparative disadvantage to SEC advisors because they don't have the same marketing capabilities. However, they're sort of going to wait and see, and if it works, they'll implement it. If not, they'll make adjustments as the SEC has to pull it back. And I think the same will happen with, now that this case has been upheld by the Massachusetts Supreme Court. I would expect to see the same thing, and that is other states are going to look at it and say, okay, now we have a model to kind of follow. There's now case law to be able to base this off of to roll out additional rules, and I think you'll start to see it ultimately snowball. But I think one of the common misperceptions is that the states are like that someone is mandating the rules and laws that the states implement in terms of overseeing financial advisors, and that is not the case. There is an association, NASA with 2 A's, not the spaceship company, that oversees these regulators, and and so they roll out uniform rules or model rules, if you will. But the decision to implement them is totally up to the states, and so. Last thing I'll say is that the beauty of advocating at the state level is that there are usually just a handful of regulators, and you can make a big difference with the people. You can go sit across from the folks that ultimately are the decision makers on how they're going to pursue some of these things. And not every state's going to sign up at the same time, but I do expect to start to see more and more. And I really have a hard time imagining Massachusetts is going to roll back their fiduciary rule. So I think this only goes one direction, even if it's not going as fast as we want.
And
Thank you, Alan.
the other thing to add here, Alan, he didn't mention that there's been pushback on some of the revenue models that XYPN planners use from the states, mainly because they don't really understand them or totally understand what advisors do. And I ran into that at the SEC too. I had an advisor with a large firm accompany me to a meeting at the SEC, and we met with a couple of staffers. And at one point we mentioned, well, they're fiduciaries and they don't take commissions. And the immediate sharp retort from the SEC people was, well, they got to get paid somehow. And there was a long silence. And then we said, well, yeah, they get paid by their clients, But the point is that it didn't occur to them that there was somebody out there making money without earning commissions. And I was stunned that at the level of ignorance that you find at the regulators, who mostly work in an office somewhere and don't get out much, and they're surprisingly young. And so they're not former advisors. They're not people who've worked as interns at an advisory firm. They're young lawyers who are brought in to administer rules whose real world implications they don't really totally understand. They do understand that 7-figure salary payout in the future, that pot at the end of the rainbow, and that may be curable if there's more. I know Canute has had some of those conversations too, and it's appalling how little actual real world understanding you're dealing with on the other side of that desk.
I think
Go
ahead, Alan.
Canute, sorry.
No, I was going to say, yes, I've had some of the same experiences. I guess I attribute it a little bit differently, but more to the central question. Sam, thank you for raising that question about Massachusetts. This gives me a chance to say yes, and this institute wrote an amicus on that and submitted that. But separate from that, to look at the court opinion is to engage in a lesson through sort of a brief history of fiduciary and how it's been properly, I think, interpreted. And maybe we ought to be circulating that to some of the people that we bump into that don't seem to have been apprised of what happened before 5 or 10 years ago. So, okay, Alan, what did you want to add on?
Yeah, I think it's important to call out that ultimately the SEC was, the charged with overseeing the delivery of investment advice, and the regulators have not been able to keep up with the ever evolving nature of what it is that what I would call financial advisors do. And so I agree with Bob that the regulators many times, or almost exclusively, are attorneys or have some sort of compliance background, but they are charged with overseeing investment advice. They're trained on how to oversee the delivery of that service. And yet financial advice now is 90% other stuff. And so, I mean, it does raise questions of, do they even have a right to regulate the delivery of financial advice? Is that even in their purview? If not, should it be? Obviously, they have taken the stance that it is. I've never known regulators to try to get rid of the ability to regulate. So, you know, I think that is a reality. But the one caution I would give is, I have definitely been guilty when we've worked with some of the state regulators of just being like, oh, you're just out to like harm the small advisor, and you don't like us, and you're you know, is sort of that evil negative mentality. And anytime we talk to the regulators, they may have some ignorance around a specific issue or a specific approach or what our advisors are doing, but it is ubiquitous when we work with the regulators that they all want to protect consumers. And they don't, many times they don't really care how, they just want to be sure consumers are protected. And so I do believe that they mean well, even if we sort of have to catch up in terms of you know, the services that advisors are ultimately delivering. You know, there's been a big push at the state level for gap-based financials, and so you've got folks making $50,000 on accrual basis, or you know, on accrual basis accounting, which is absurd. I wish they would shift that focus over to you know, tell me more about the advice you're giving, and whether or not you're qualified to give that advice, or you even registered to give that advice. But you know, those days are coming, hopefully.
Good. Thank you, Alan.
Well,
I was going to see
the SEC, I think staffers are not what Alan said, that the regulators really want to protect consumers. I think that's true at the state level. I don't think that's true at the SEC level. I think at the SEC level, there's intense skepticism about anything that contradicts what they hear from constant barrage of messages from the lobbyists at the wirehouses. And so, you know, you actually go in there, Canute and other people have told me, you go in there and the first thing they say is, oh, stop polishing your halo. You know, don't tell me how wonderful you are. And I spent a lot of time thinking about that. And I think the real response, the best response, is that we've reached the point now where a fiduciary fee-only advisor has roughly the same concerns, maybe exactly the same concerns as a consumer. And so instead of going in there and saying, we as advisors want to lobby you on behalf of something that is going to help us and disadvantage the brokerage firms, we want to come in and advocate for the consumer, purely and simply. This is not about us. This is about what would be best for consumers. And as consumers, and by the way, as professionals, we believe that these are the concerns that should be addressed on behalf of consumers. It's taken a long time for us to get there, but I think now that we're there, I think it might be more effective to be a consumer lobbying or give consumer messages rather than professional messages.
Thank you, Bob. Any other questions? Since just feel free to take yourself off mute and ask them, so everyone can hear your question. Any other questions? No other questions. Wow.
This has been a remarkable presentation. We've done an outstanding job at
We've solved all the problems.
Any questions in the minds of the viewers at all.
I guess we have solved all the problems. Let me ask both Bob and Alan to give your opinion on to what extent you believe that Alan, you know, your members, or Bob, those advisors that you are in contact with all the time, believe that this is a concern that they need to be concerned about. they need to be worried about, that it affects them, their firm directly. The fact that the SEC does what the SEC does. Give me a sense of what you think that they are thinking as a group.
Yeah, I think that I'll say, and I put myself in this camp, 10, 12 years ago when I got into the industry, where I believed that, let's just have a fiduciary rule. Everyone's a fiduciary all the time. And I hear that from a lot of advisors. And while from a consumer perspective, I love it, from a business perspective, I think it's sort of like careful what you wish for, because it is true that being a fiduciary has been a differentiator in building your practice. Now, yes, somebody else can claim to be a fiduciary, but ultimately consumers can dig through the layers and figure that out. And not all of them do, or not all of them will. But again, we have seen there's a reason for the growth of the independent advisor and the fiduciary model. And so on one side, I would say careful what you wish for. I also agree with Bob that it is more challenging to approach the regulators from a business owner perspective, because we are lobbying on behalf of our own businesses, not necessarily, we're saying it's for the best interest of the consumer, but the assumption, as it should be, is that we're trying to do what's best for our business, because we are. And so I would love to see more advocacy efforts coming from the consumer side. I don't know what organization that would be, AARP or something like that, a collection of folks who maybe they could bring resources to back. But it is sort of this interesting piece. But, I would say that in the end, as business owners, the regulations and the laws are gonna be constantly changing, and it's all about adapting and focusing on what actually matters, which is taking care of your clients. And if you're doing right by your clients, you are serving them in their best interests, then you're going to build a successful business, no matter what the SEC does.
And
Thank you, Alan.
I think that advisors should be taking the gloves off. I know an advisory firm in Minneapolis used to market itself as we rescue people from their brokers. And I don't think I think we've been told that we shouldn't be doing negative marketing. We shouldn't denigrate. We shouldn't. But I think it's fair now at this point to say there's a pretty big gap between predators and advisors. And not every broker is a predator, and not every advisor is a good guy. But I think you can draw a pretty clear distinction between how brokers are compensated and their incentives, and how advisors are compensated and their incentives. And also, I think maybe educating yourself on some of these other issues that kind of give away the game. You look at FINRA's board of directors, and even the consumer members, the board of directors, are former executives at large brokerage firms. You look at who are they carrying water for? Well, it's pretty obvious, because they don't allow actual consumers to be, or if they are actual consumers, they're lawyers who serve the brokerage community. There are a lot of issues that arose during the period when the analysts were saying on one side, this is an excellent stock, and on the other side, they're saying this is a bunch of garbage. There's the fact that the brokerage firms have their own accounts that they invest in, and when a dog stock shows up in their own account, they tell the brokers that you need to sell this stock to your customers because we want to get rid of it. There's a whole history behind the brokerage industry, not to mention when 2008, 2009, they brought the entire economic system to the brink of collapse. There's a lot of history about whether or not the brokerage industry is beneficial to individual consumers or the public at large. And I think the more advisors can bring that up and say, have you got friends who are working with a brokerage firm? They're charging 1.5% on the portfolio, and there are also these additional hidden fees that are raising that to 2.5%, and they don't get real financial planning services. we can do a better job for them. And if you care about them, send them our way. I think there's a lot of one-on-one, individual, and maybe even on your website marketing that can be done that will draw that distinction. I think it's time for advisors to be a little more aggressive about that.
Alan?
Yeah, like I said, I do take a little bit different of a view on that, Bob, because I believe
That's
that
not
in the
permitted.
end,
No, we can't do that.
when we say something as an advisor who's running a fiduciary focused firm that's fee only and working with my clients, anything I say is viewed through the lens of self-interested marketing, because it is. I mean, in the end, I'm just trying to build a successful business. And so, I do believe that one of the big catalysts, I don't have any data on this, so y'all can tell me if you disagree, but one of the big catalysts for this move to fiduciary was actually NAPFA's unbelievable work with the media throughout the sort of 90s and early 2000s, when Ben Lewis was there running their PR. They really preached this message of, hey, if you're a member of the media, and as we've sort of seen the growth of the blogosphere and influencer marketplace, if you're truly a member of the media, not being compensated by the people that you recommend, then it's really simple. It makes it a lot easier to send folks to NAPFA because they're all fee only, they're all fiduciary. You don't have to say, go to this website and then sort out the ones who aren't good, because there's a mix. And so there was this really amazing this amazing shift through earned media, through working with members of the media, because they had such amazing platforms. And I'm not sure who's doing that work at this point. I feel like NAPFA sort of laid down that mantle. They at least according to I pulled their most recent 990, which is from 2000 or from 2021, so it's been a couple of years. But they have a public policy director on retainer for $150,000 a year. The FPA has spent historically hundreds of thousands of dollars. CFP board has these resources. There's a lot of resources being put towards public policy, but it's not coordinated. And it's not necessary. I think there are better ways that maybe those resources could be allocated. So I would encourage advisors to really talk to the associations, because I believe this is, at least for our world, like that's where we should be. That's where it should be coming from. It's never great when for-profit companies are the ones suing regulators, but we've done it and we'll do it again if we have to. But really, working with the associations now. Speaking out both sides of my mouth, the struggle that the associations have is that they have such a wide range of membership, even amongst NAPFA and FPA. Their membership base is so wide and so diverse that sometimes it can be hard for them to agree on sort of advocacy efforts, because they have such disparate interests. And so it's why you see sort of more broad things like, bring back tax deductibility of investment advice. I'm like, yes, that's great, but also like I would love to see efforts somewhere else. But that's the one thing that all their members can agree on. No advisors disagreeing with that. So
I'd like to drill down on this Bob Allen difference here, and let me reframe it a little bit. I don't think anyone would question that when you're at a social engagement, for example, and you meet someone and they say they've got this most wonderful advisor and he has a great office down at Edward Jones, and can't think enough about this great advisor. That's a hard situation, and to sort of delve into, if you wanted to delve into, because of what is apparent. The person is very satisfied. So in that sense, I'm with the idea of, let's not go negative. Let's not say that they're all evil, whatever. But on the other hand, and this is, I guess, what I wrestle with myself is, and in the spirit of a couple of things that Bob talked about, is it possible to just set out factual differences? And yes, in our view, what is on our side of the ledger about a factual characteristic, is positive, and what's on their side of the ledger is not so positive. I guess without being naive or romantic, isn't it possible just to set out the facts and say that And this is the difference. And actually, what this plays into me is I've spent a little bit of time with a group of flat fee folks. Some of your members, some are not, Alan. And one of the things that strikes me, which I think that many RIs don't fully appreciate, is the significance of apparent transparency. And what I mean by that, they go to the website, they get a flat fee price for a certain service or another service, and they sometimes can even get, this is what this services entails. And I mean, oh my God, it's right there in front of them. And if it's written in plain English, they can actually understand it. If I pay this much for the next 2 quarters, or this much for a one-time assignment, this is what I'll get. And I don't think that that's appreciated enough, even among the RIA community. It drives people crazy. They frequently don't say anything about it because they feel stupid. They feel like they should understand it. And anyway, so this is what I think about, in terms of, standing back and saying, what if we just set out the facts, set out a set of facts, a set of attributes, and sort of start from that point of view, and yes, not start from the point of view that in the spirit of a former president, talk about evildoers. That's not the way to go. So, Alan, give me a response to that.
Yeah. The what's the old quote? One man's truth is another man's bias. So, because we are all fiduciary advocates, I agree that it's just lay out the facts, just say, here's what you do. But you can't say why you are better without saying why someone else is worse. You just can't. You can't lay out those facts around fiduciary without creating a hierarchy of acceptable behavior. And so again, I go back to the best research on this is on political ads, where really negative ads against your opponent does not get you more votes, but it does get people to not vote for the other person. And so that, so really if we push this sort of rise in negative marketing, negative advertising, what I think will happen is people will just not hire any financial advisor versus going and hiring the Edward Jones advisor. And so what I would say is that I think there is, what we encourage our advisors to do is establish your competency in a particular, we would say in a particular niche, which, Steve Wershing defines as the problem that you enjoy solving. Establish your competency, become a deep subject matter expert in that area, and your competency will shine through, because that does give you the ability, you can showcase your knowledge and your skill set and your expertise without denigrating other advisors in the process, and sort of bringing down the bar. And so I think that's going to be, but we see the fastest growing firms are ones that have a really clearly defined niche. They are also fiduciary, but if you go to their websites, you're not seeing the word fiduciary and fee only all over it. They're saying, I'm the best advisor at working with women at pre-IPO tech companies with stock options. That is what I do. That is all I do. And so if that's you, let's talk. Here's my blog and resources that showcasing my expertise through education and content. I think that's going to be, it's a slow play. It's going to take decades longer than I wish it did. But, I personally, that's where I would push advisors is around competency-based marketing versus negative, more fact negative marketing, I guess.
So I've got 2 responses for this. One is that drawing the distinction between a fiduciary advisor and a brokerage firm can be as simple as when somebody is talking to the firm down the street and your firm, you say, here is a fiduciary oath. And you can see my signature on it. And I'm going to give you a blank one, and you could take it down there and see if they're willing to sign it, because I think that's, something that you should have somebody who has pledged to work in your best interest. And if they don't sign it, you're going to hear a whole lot of explanation about why, this is just totally irrelevant. And as they talk, the more they talk, the more you want to be concerned. The other is go to the Broker Check website and check out Edward Jones or Merrill Lynch, or, and see whether they've had any regulatory incidents. And of course, there are thousands. and say, is that really who you want to work with? And that's it. If you do nothing more than that, I think you're gaining a certain amount of credibility. But the other thing that I would talk about, though, and this is kind of my 42-year perspective, is that there's been a cat and mouse game going on between the brokerage firms and the fiduciary advisors for decades. First of all, it was, we sell our products based on a financial plan. We sell what you need. And then the financial planning was adopted by the brokerage. Oh yeah, we do financial planning too. So there's no difference. And then the advisory firms were, well, we're fee only. And then the brokerage firms were, well, we have asset gatherers. They're fee only. They're paid by fees that are paid out of the portfolio also, fee based. Yeah. And then there was fiduciary, and we're fiduciary. Oh, well, we're best interest. And the SEC actively eagerly participated in that obfuscation. And then, now I think the next stage of that cat and mouse game is the advisor community leaving the AUM revenue model for some flat fee or hourly or subscription model of some sort. I call it flat fee monthly. And, I think that's inevitable. I don't think the way to, I don't think there's any profession where somebody says, how much am I going to pay you for your advice? And you say, I'm not sure. How much have you got? I don't think that's sustainable. I think that's going to have to go away at some point. Of course, I predicted that for a long time and it hasn't happened yet. But I think if that happens, if advisors are paid on some other way than the assets that are gathered into their firm, the brokerage firms are going to have a lot of trouble following that model. And that will be a clearer distinction than anything we've created before. That might be a distinction that they can't obfuscate. And it's possible that the SEC will step in and say, well, I'm not sure we want you to do that, because their brokerage overlords will say, let's get rid of this flat fee model, or let's get rid of this. So the two things I would say is, one, it's not that hard to make that distinction. If you bring up some of the headlines from, Fabulous Fab boasting how he was able to sell garbage to people, and he was really good at it, or the infamous situation where forgot which brokerage firm created an investment that was deliberately designed to fail, and then sold a whole bunch of it to their customers, and then encouraged their best customers to bet against it. These are examples that you can, and once again, going to the SEC website. And the other is the quicker we evolve out of the AUM revenue model, and it's not happening quickly. I just did a fee report that shows that's not happening quickly. The quicker we can make a distinction that I think the brokerage firms won't be able to emulate.
Thank you, Bob. Scott Reed has a question. Scott, you're on.
Well, I just had a quick reaction to, I've been in this 38 years. And one reason, Bob, I got your fee report as well. One reason it's hard is because you can take $1 million client who's more than happy to pay you 1%. No way in hell he's paying you $10,000 a year, which is just the way you view the money that's out there. And when they see it and write a check for it every quarter, it's just really hard. That's why it's going to be so slow to get there, I think. But the thing that Knut, ever since I've known you, I've never understood why there's just a right and a wrong in this battle for clients' money. There's a place for salespeople. There's a place to create new products and pitch them to people and get them out there. And then we, fiduciaries, look at them. If they're really good, we'll use them too, because they're really good. But somebody's got to create them and pitch them out there. And then we just use their stuff and throw away the bad stuff and use the good stuff. And the problem I have with our industry right now is that, we could solve this with just going back to the marketing rule and having people quit lying in their commercials about what they do, because people found out that it was really cool to be a fiduciary. And so they wanted to look like one and act like one without being one. And that's what all the ads say is, follow the green line, or we think about your money problems more than you do, and all this stuff when they're selling product. And the people that need me very badly, but most of the people out there that invest probably don't need me. They need somebody. They want to make their own decisions, do their own things. They want to be the captain of their ship, and they need somebody to pitch them ideas, and they need to know that those ideas come at a cost, and they probably don't know what the cost is, but it's buyer beware, and that's what they need to be doing. The people that need me desperately, and they have no idea who I am because everybody is out there trying to look like me. And the problem I have is I don't want those people that don't need me. I want to find the people that do need me and explain to them why they need me. Why, if you want to go earn money, and you know how to earn money, but you don't want to worry about your investments, you want somebody with a fiduciary obligation and legal obligation to do that, then ask me to do that for you, but don't ask a stockbroker. If you want to retire and not worry, you want to get on a boat and not worry about your investments, find me. Don't find a stockbroker. But when you go out there and look, I don't do a lot of advertising, but everybody advertising out there wants to look like they're a stockbroker, wants to look like they're a fiduciary when they're not. In this battle between the two of us, just bifurcate what we do and then explain to people who the hell we are and what we do, and let people have the knowledge to make a good decision on who they need to work with. And that's the part about this whole debate that for 20 years that I've been involved with it, it seemed to me to just fallen short. And I agree, Bob said that they don't know in Washington. What my experience I had about 10 years ago, Canute, we talked about that when I talked with, I had a lunch with 5 different congressional staffs at the same time, and not a single one of them could define what a fiduciary did. So
Yeah.
because all of the money comes from the brokerage side and the investment banking side and the insurance companies.
Yeah.
Sorry, that was my rant.
The core of what you're saying, I don't want to cut you off, but the core of what you're saying I think is important. I think all of us would agree completely that we don't want to banish salespeople from the marketplace. There's not any incentive, there's not any reason to say nobody can sell. I think that what you're saying, and I completely agree with it, is that we should have a clear distinction between whether you're a salesperson or whether you're a fiduciary. And one of the things that Canute was saying, you have that awkward conversation with somebody who really likes their broker. One of the things I might respond is, well, you're happy working with a salesperson, and I think that's great. And they might say, wait, what? Or they might not.
Right. Good point, Scott.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Any other questions?
Well, Canute, I'll pitch in here with a few things. First, Scott, totally agree with everything that you said. And I've been involved in this fiduciary discussion debate for 2 decades. And for many of us that take this conflict, if that's what we want to call it, seriously, is that position that there's a need for brokers, and there are people that want brokers and prefer brokers, and they should be able to get brokers. But the issue has been this obfuscation of who does what, and it's all about titles, and it's all about the SEC in the late 90s. And Bob, I think you were alluding to this earlier. They decided to go ahead and let brokers call themselves advisors.
Without registering. Yeah.
Instead of brokers, they could call themselves advisors and not register. Yeah, we know some of the history then came along, and then fees became to play a factor. And if you call yourself an advisor and you charge a fee for your advice, then then you do need to register. Okay, well, that's fine. But now you can do both. you can be a salesman and you can be an advisor, registered, and be a fiduciary really sometimes, and really not all the time, as long as you're acting in your client's best interest, whatever that is. And my big fear with this recent thing that the SEC has come out with is I see the evolution of all of this to ultimately all of us being regulated by FINRA. That if we're homogenous, we're all the same. It's just a matter of, how you get compensated, no big deal there. Then why have two different sets of rules and two different regulators, examiners, et cetera? It's going to be FINRA. We fought that battle a decade ago. We won it. I think it was a temporary reprieve, and longer term, that to me is something that every RIA firm out there needs to have some sense of. Is that the direction this is all going? Is one, it's going to be FINRA, and two, it's only going to be big firms. Look at all of the proposed rules that are coming out. If all of those get passed, those hundreds of pages each, there's no way a small firm like mine is going to be able to continue to do business. It's going to take somebody full-time every day being here, documenting and doing all of these things that the SEC is saying that we need to do.
So I have a visceral response to it, first of all, because I think FINRA's goal would be to eliminate the competition to the brokerage firms who are their members. And I think we as a profession need to fight tooth and nail against letting that happen. The other comment, though, you said that the regulators or the regulations will drive smaller firms out of business. The interesting thing is we've had a rising tide of regulations, but we've also had a rising tide of consultants. And I mean, we had at our conference, we had an artificial intelligence CCO service that actually automates a lot of the stuff that these new initiatives are asking for or wanting to be monitored.
Yeah.
So I think what's happening, or what has happened traditionally, or what has happened historically, is that yes, more regulation and then more sophistication in the consulting world to match that. And I'm hoping that that'll continue. It looks like
I don't believe that's the way it's going to work, Bob, because they've passed some of those proposed rules. They've just scratched the surface. Look at what's out there in the way of the proposed rules that they haven't passed. And without, I don't want to take time to go into what all of those are, but they're out there. And
the money laundering
I read through them, and no one believes in the importance of strong, effective regulators and regulations than I do, because the next Bernie Madoff that comes along just really makes it difficult for me to be out there trying to sell my services. So yeah, the regulators are important. They're critical. They need to find the bad guys, but they're going to take us the same place that FINRA took the small independent broker dealer. Since the year 2000, every year there's been fewer and fewer small independent broker dealers. And as far as I'm concerned, that's by design. It's much easier for FINRA to examine and oversee a handful of big firms than it is many, many small firms. And so they've already done that. I think it's naive to believe the SEC isn't trying to do the same thing. And I've had conversations with some high up folks that couldn't deny that that's the case. So
yeah, I've been involved in those debates where the conversation is only large firms will survive and the small firms will be driven, and the SEC wants that to happen. I think the SEC is clueless, frankly, on that topic, and I don't see them as having an agenda, because I don't think they have enough data to form an agenda, enough sophistication. And the other discussion that I hear is that, only large firms will be able to handle all of the complexities that the marketplace is bringing to us, including regulation. But that's never been true. And it's never been true
Well, it
about
hasn't
any
been
other
true so far.
profession. I've
Bob,
done presentations about the distribution of size of firms in the legal and your accounting profession. And in each case, you had, a couple of extremely large national firms, a smaller number of regional firms, or I should say a larger number of regional firms, a somewhat larger number of local city firms, and a huge number of small independent firms with 1, 2, 3 partners. And that seems to be where professions go in terms of distribution of the spectrum of size.
Exactly. That's always been my argument too, Bob. And I come from that kind of profession as a CPA. A lot more small 1, 2 partner CPA firms than big firms. I mean, in terms of just numbers of CPAs that work for them, it's true. But they're not dealing with an SEC that's out of control. This SEC is out of control. I'm very involved with the IAA, so I'm seeing these proposed rules. I'm trying to read some of them, but they're hundreds and hundreds of pages long. In the summaries that IAA puts together, I read through those and it scares the hell out of me, because me and my one partner can't. Again, we would have to hire a full-time person to be here to do all of the things in documentation. So that's a huge concern. And ultimately, are there enough qualified compliance people out there to do the work that all this is going to require? Most of the examiners.
Alan, do you want to jump in on with all this commentary about small firms? Maybe you want to. Is there something you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I agree fully with Bob that when complexity is introduced or additional rules and all of that burden is introduced, that the technology providers will solve that problem. So just a minor example, it wasn't too long ago that it was never a specific rule that came out, but the regulator started to apply the marketing and advertising rules to social media. So now you have to archive your social media. Okay, so there were some advisors that had an Excel spreadsheet and they were taking screenshots every time they would, post something on Facebook or LinkedIn or Twitter. And then providers, us being one of them, built a archiving solution that you go in, you tell us your handle, and we archive it for you. And so you spend 0 time archiving all of your marketing communications. And so when I look across the industry and sort of the evolution of how the staffing of firms has worked, I think we talked about this at Bob's conference last week. I think it's so interesting that the number of clients per advisor has not budged in decades. Advisors are still working with 75 to 100 clients. What we have started to see are fewer and fewer and fewer back of office team members, and the back office is really where this type of innovation has happened, despite the fact that we have even more rules to adhere to than we did. And candidly, the amount of money that advisors are making continues to go up as well, the net profit to advisors. And so, I have 0 concerns that the small firms will ultimately be regulated out of existence. I think the more likely is that the SEC will continue to move up their minimum assets it'll go from 100 million to 250 million and push a lot of folks back to the states, because it wasn't too long ago that it was 25 million, not 100. And you'll continue to see the states regulating the small firms, and doing so in a way that isn't trying to put them out of business, because in the end the state needs the small firms because we fund those regulators, right? So the regulators aren't trying to get rid of us because we fund them. They only exist because we exist. So I'm personally not concerned, but I do think it opens up doors and opportunities for technology and service providers to be able to step in and help solve some of this complexity, which I continue to see. And Bob, give a great example of a provider that's doing that.
Yeah, well, I hope you guys are right.
They gave out wonderful cookies at our conference, which I thought was also a charming feature of the technology.
Okay.
So,
All right. Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Clark. As we're coming towards the top of the hour, does anybody else have a question or a comment to add to this conversation at this time? I guess you guys have answered all the questions, or almost all the questions. We can say that anyway. But Bob,
either that or we
looks
put
like
everybody to sleep.
you put
Yeah.
everybody to sleep.
Canute, this is Dan.
Dan.
Morsian, how you doing? No question. Just wanted to thank you for putting this on and to thank Alan and Bob for participating. It's a wonderful discussion. Lots of angles to this. It's a mess. Got to keep working on it, try to figure it out. But I appreciate you taking the time to do this, and I appreciate all your efforts very much.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you, Dan. Bob and Alan, any sort of final uplifting, energizing, encouraging comments to bring this conversation to a close for the moment?
Yeah, I mean, I'm nothing if not an eternal optimist. So you see that come through in the conversation today. But I would just say that, look, in the end, we want to move the needle. I want to see the industry shift. But in the end, the most important thing that advisors can do is keep their own house in order. And you do amazing work. You take care of people. You help people. This is a helping profession that actually looks forwards instead of just backwards, like most other helping professions. And so the work that you're doing is impacting the lives of the clients that you're working with. And even if everyone else wants to run off the rails, take care of your clients, take care of the people that you're working with, and you'll have made the difference that I think you probably want to make on the world with your time here.
Thank you, Alan.
And I'll
Okay.
just add that, I'm going to be doing everything I can to expose the fact that the SEC has been captured, because I think that's something that everybody needs to pay attention to. The regulators are not supposed to be working at the behest of some of the people that they're regulating. And what we have right now is unacceptable. I'm not sure how we roll it back, but at least we can point out that it's unacceptable periodically. And what more can I ask for? I'm a writer. This is an ugly, awful, terrible thing. I'm really glad to have something to write about.
There you put your self-interest front and center, Bob.
That's right.
Right
It's
there.
conflict of interest.
There you go. All right. Well, listen, thank you, gentlemen. This has been a very enlightening conversation for me to hear this back and forth. And I think we've covered a lot of significant points. And as I said, we'll have the recording up on the website hopefully by the end of the day. So thank you. Thank those who joined us, and have a wonderful end completion to this last full week of Fiduciary September. So with that, we'll sign off for now, and until we start up again tomorrow afternoon. Thank you, one and all.